Welcome to the agency business model of now, reimagining your agency on the Communo platform. I'm Blair Enns, founder and CEO of Win Without Pitching. So I've been involved with Communo for 2 years officially, and even a little bit longer than that, kind of unofficially. So why are we doing this webinar now? Well, you may have noticed that the world has changed. And since the pandemic hit, I've been writing, which is kind of my default to any external stimulus, just start writing. One of the topics I've written about is the need to explore adjacencies in your services and your markets, but more importantly, your alternative business models. I recently said to a friend of mine, I said, I think you and I, and probably everybody in the agency business, we all get like a C- on business model. I've seen a lot of really good businesses squished or crushed as their owner tried to fit them into a traditional fee-for-service agency model. So this is really about exploring an alternative business model. But against the backdrop of human carnage that we're experiencing right now, we're not going to talk about that, but we have to acknowledge that lives have been lost, and there are a lot of horrible things going on in the world, and there's been a lot of financial carnage among owners of independent creative and marketing firms as well. So I've seen all of that, but I've really been blown away by the pivots, the creative responses that I have seen from agency owners who have made these sudden changes in response to these constraints or difficult times, and have not only kind of risen to the challenge and shaped their business in a way that allows it to succeed or survive, but in a way that's allowed it to thrive. Of the many questions, so again, it's just the creativity, and it shouldn't surprise me, right? We are a creative industry, but the creativity on the business model front, which frankly, I think has been lacking in our business, but in the last 90 days, it's been really impressive. One of the questions I've been fielding over the last few months is the question, is it ethical to sell right now? And one of the first persons to ask me that question was a member of the Communo sales team, reached out, I think it was via email, and said, hey, is it still okay to be doing outreach right now? And I wrote an article about this, and I've talked about it on numerous podcasts and webcasts. But my response to that member of the sales team was, well, that depends on what your definition of sell is. If your definition of selling is talking people into things, then it's never been ethical to sell, and the market will remind you of that at this moment. If you view selling as the act of helping, of talking people into, of facilitating, of value creation, of looking for those for whom you can help create extraordinary value, then you have an ethical view of selling, and it's ethical to sell right now. I further went on to add, I said, you know what? There are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of agency principals around the world right now who are rethinking their business model. And you're sitting on the solution, or a solution. So you should see it as your obligation to sell. And with that, we ended the exchange, and he went off and continued to resume what he was doing, which was selling, and I hope ethically. But in that moment, I realized I had the obligation to do this too, because I've been, as I've said, I've been associated with Communo for a couple of years now. It's a startup launched by some agency principal friends and former clients. I invested in the very beginning because it was the first real attempt that I saw to enable what I believed was the business model of the future. And I realized that, okay, I'm sitting on the solution too. And I've always been very careful in the last 2 years of using my platform and the people who follow us to not want to sell something else that's not Win Without Pitching that I have a vested financial interest in. But in that moment, I realized the advice I'm giving that salesperson is the advice I need to take. So I reached out to the Communo team and I said, I want to do a webinar for my audience on why these independent agency owners should be considering this Hollywood studio model and Communo, the platform that enables it. And I want to interview Chris Kneeland, not Ryan Gill, who is your partner in 3 different businesses, because as we'll hear from Chris in a minute, Chris and Ryan launched Communo, spun it off, and then Ryan left Cult, the parent firm, to go run Communo. I want to hear about the origin story from the person who is still running that agency. And I said, I want to interview John Winsor. And I just met John in February of this year at The Gathering, which is one of many businesses that Ryan and Chris own together. And I don't know if you remember this, John, but we had a quick chat. I said, in 2009, when you launched Victors and Spoils, I reached out to your then business partner, Evan Fry, and I said, hey, I'd like to interview you about this radical new business model. And he looked at my email address and said, win without pitching. Sounds like you're not going to be for this model. We'll talk about why in a minute. We ended up having an email exchange. And I don't remember if I ever wrote the article, but I remember thinking, this is a gimmick. It's never going to fly. So with that, let me introduce John, then I'll introduce Chris, and then we're going to have a conversation. So John Winsor. Sorry, I'll stop the monologue here in a minute. And I'm reading here, so I'm not looking at you, John. So I'm going to read your bio. And then I'll give you the chance to correct whatever I butcher.
That's fine.
In 2009, John left ad agency Hotshop, Crispin, Porter, and Bogusky to co-found Victors and Spoils, the first agency to crowdsource creative talent. And again, I thought this is a gimmick, it'll never fly, but the firm rapidly won large accounts like Harley-Davidson, Gap, and Dish Networks. And in less than 3 years, I think, was acquired by Havas, where John went on to serve as Chief Innovation Officer. John is now entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School's Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard, or LISH, say that twice. So entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School and founder of Open Assembly. And I think that's where you and Chris met. I'll ask you about Open Assembly in a few minutes, but welcome, John.
Hey, thanks, Blair. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the chat.
Me too.
Chris Kneeland. In 2011, it says here that Chris Kneeland merged his ad agency with the digital firm he had acquired. That digital firm was a client of mine. Disaster struck almost immediately, and I can't wait to hear your version of this disaster, Chris, when the new full-service agency, and maybe that's a key right there, lost their largest account, representing 65% of revenue. So Chris and partner Ryan Gill pivoted their firm into the specialized and rebranded agency that today is Cult, an audience engagement agency. And at the same time they launched Cult, they changed their business model. Now I'm going to go back to this and I can look at you guys. That's it for me talking at you. Welcome to both of you, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thrilled to be here.
Yeah, thanks.
You guys here. You guys you lend a lot of, I think, not only perspective but credibility to the journey that we're on. So thank you for taking the time, and I'll do my best to share the microphone with John because he's earned it more than I have, but I certainly have a lot of things I'm excited to share as well.
Thanks.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Chris, and I didn't have to, and John didn't have to. John, first question for you.
Yeah.
So you're at Crispin Porter in 2009, and I think that was probably near the height of the agency, where it was probably the global creative hotshop, certainly in North America. Is that right?
Yeah. So when I merged my company, Radar Communications, which was a strategy and research company in 2007, there were 40 folks at Crispin, about 100 globally at Crispin, and there were 15 of us, so 40 in the Boulder office when Alex moved out here. And then 2 years later, we had 1,200 globally, and we were creative agency of the decade. So a little bit of growth in a couple of years. Yeah. And, what we brought, obviously Crispin's an amazing creative shop, and Alex is an amazing guy. We had always been working on the assumption at Radar, this idea of co-creation. I was one of the guys that coined that term in marketing in 2002 in a book called Beyond the Brand, and then built a company around that idea of co-creation. That was a term that we used pre kind of crowdsourcing, right? How do you engage with your customers to get stuff done? So Alex and I talked a lot about that, and that seemed really in sync with what Crispin was trying to do from a creative standpoint. And that's what you saw, like things like the Domino's campaigns and the I'm a PC from Microsoft, and the Burger King work was all fueled by really deep connection with customers.
So if you just described exactly what co-creation is, I missed it. So how is it different from crowdsourcing creative?
Well, I mean, the beginning, so that was in 2002, 2001. And one of the things that I had a company called Sports and Fitness Publishing, and bought a magazine out of bankruptcy called Women's Sports and Fitness. And back then, when I bought the magazine and put everything I had on the line, including my house to buy it, there wasn't even a women's sports movement, but I went and met with Mark Parker and Tinker Hatfield at Nike and said, do you think this women's sports thing is going to be any big, going to be big? And they said, oh yeah, go for it. It's going to be awesome. The problem was that I saw is that, we had this passionate group of 250,000 early adoptive women athletes that were kind of at the top of their game. But, we knew brands had all this money. And by the time that they got through the funnel, the money got through the funnel with research companies and agencies and media agencies, that we get a drip of that money, right? We get $20,000 for a page. And I was really intrigued when I sold that company to Condé Nast. I was really intrigued by taking that group of consumers and early adoptive consumers and not being at the bottom of the funnel as an audience, but being at the top of the funnel to develop strategy and product ideas for those folks. And that worked out really, really well. We did work globally for HP and Intel and all the car companies and really, so that was really intriguing to Alex. And Alex and I, he came to town and we just discovered each other from riding mountain bikes and became friends and decided to merge the companies, and the rest is history.
Okay. So now you're at the Creative Hot Shop and you decide to leave because you see a trend in the marketplace. Because you didn't just start a new firm in Victors and Spoils. It was a new agency model, right?
Yeah. So essentially what transpired was that we had kind of been playing around with that at Crispin. We were growing at 60% a year. We were going way over that, but we had 60% turnover in the creative department. And I think the inspiration for all this really was Crispin, right? We had 7 creative directors and 250 creatives. And literally we had a balcony where the creative directors were. And physically the creative directors would throw a brief over the railing into the pit, they called it. And people would dive for that. Like, depending on the creative director, they would grab it. The philosophy of the agency was best brief wins. And so, if you were a client that didn't have a great brief for whatever reason, your work just didn't get done for weeks, if not months. And so there was this kind of internal crowdsourcing. Nobody was assigned to one client. It was just a free for all. And that was really inspiring for me, for the guy who ran strategy and product innovation. And then we got into a situation on a small client. We were always interested in trying to take small new clients. So we took on Bramo Motorcycles, which is an electric motorcycle company, in 2008. And we just won Creative Agency of the Decade globally. And so we thought, well, we don't have any really creative resources in-house. Let's crowdsource the creative. And as you can imagine, the Global Creative Agency of the Decade crowdsourcing creative on the CrowdSpring platform caused a bit of a shitstorm in the industry. People were really, really pissed off at us. But as we saw the results, Boguski and I both looked at each other and said, holy crap, this is like some of the best creative we've received in the history of the shop. And this is the new model. Like, the agencies are going to go out of business. They're going to be 1/10 of the size, and they're going to be, filled with all these freelance networks. So we tried to sell that idea to Miles Nadal at MDC. And of course he said, hey, no way, that ruins my whole business model. So I went out and found some funding and started Victors and Spoils in April of 2019.
And that worked out pretty well for you, didn't it? Even the naysayers like me, who said it's never going to fly, like, you were so successful so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. Like that, Stuart Elliott was kind enough to run an article about us, half-page article in the New York Times. And by the end of that day, we had, the next morning we had 1,000 people in the crowd, and Dish Network gave us $5 million, their $5 million account. So we were off and running day one. And we took some of your principles, pitch without, win without pitching. Certainly that's the way we won the Harley stuff, and that became kind of legendary too. But it was only because we had a big variable cost team of 10,000 people that were super psyched to do great work, and a small curation team on top of it. So,
all right, great, Chris. Let's go over to you. I told a little bit. I told the short version of your origin story, and I said, you kind of you lost your big account, restructured, et cetera, and then you launched a new business model. So feel free to like correct whatever I butchered, and then just walk us through what happens, how you go from cult to Communo is born, and then we'll back up and connect like how you and John met.
For sure. And can you hear me okay, Blair?
Yeah.
My computer's giving me weird alerts. Listen, we had a problem at our agency, a client concentration problem. We didn't call it that at the time. We learned that from David Baker, who's my favorite of the two Bobs, by the way, years later. But we didn't realize how dangerous or precarious our agency was, having too many eggs in one client's basket. And I've come to learn that most agency principals are probably aware in the back of their mind of various red flags with their business. But as long as the revenue comes in and the staff are getting paid, we tend to ignore it. But it wasn't until that client left us that mother was necessity was the mother of invention. So we had to decide, do we scramble to replace that lost revenue with similar revenue? In our case, retail marketing. You okay on the audio there?
Yeah, I think we might be getting some feedback from John.
Maybe go on. Yeah. So that was our gut instinct. Our gut instinct was, let's go get a bunch more retail flyer and in-store design and TV and billboard kind of work. And if we've done anything right, my business partner Ryan and I had the opportunity to do the gut check and said, if we have to redo this, why don't we build something that we actually love versus just do something that pays the bills? Our businesses had devolved to a point where we were serving them versus them serving us. We were not as professionally stimulated. We were not as professionally compensated. We weren't as personally satisfied as we wanted to be. So, sort of like how, the guys that did Airbnb weren't in the hospitality business. Ryan and I wouldn't say we're schooled agency veterans. So we didn't know that we were breaking so many rules. We just started to build the business that we thought made more sense. And one of those was a win without pitching methodology, which completely transformed the way that we do business. Shameless plug for Blair. And one of them was an operating model that was patterned after, initially we patterned it after home builders. We had a home builder client, and we were so fascinated how the builder built the brand and managed the client relationship, but then worked with a network of sub-trades for the tile and the landscape and the electrical and whatnot. And so that was our original muse. We then went on to study Hollywood and sort of the demise of the golden area of Hollywood, and realized as one thing might be a fluke. Now we saw a pattern. We saw other industries that were starting to reimagine themselves the same way. And so our operating model became much more of a contingent based, or what we now call an open talent model. And, we've never looked back. And even now, in the midst of the COVID crisis, as I look around at my peers, I see how well we're weathering this storm compared to the gong shows that they're dealing with. And I'm like, here's yet another reason why I'm grateful that we changed the model so many years ago, because now many owners are having the same sort of necessity as the mother of invention wake-up call, because something bad was done to them. And I just hope they do the same thing that we do, which is use it as a gift to reimagine rather than just kind of gut through it so they can rebuild what they had previously.
And tell us a little bit about the difference between what Cult was then and what you are now. Like, you were how many people then and how many people now?
Yeah, so we changed on two angles. When we rebranded to Cult Collective, we made a very conscious decision to overemphasize the strategic and the advisory side, what Tim Williams calls the magic side of the business, and to minimize, in terms of our revenue importance, the production side. So we went upstream, and Colt became more of a marketing advisory firm who does production. But previously we were the creative shop that gave away most of the strategic thinking for free in hopes of getting the production work. So we turned that on its ear. We charged a premium for the creative work and said, if you need us to produce it, we'll do that through a low-cost provider. And then the second part of our name was the collective. So we were the cult collective. And the metaphor here is really Slack. For everybody that uses Slack as a communication device, Slack was not built as a commercial product. It was built as an internal communication tool for a product development team to talk amongst themselves. And when their product didn't go to market well, they decided, well, maybe we can monetize the Slack thing. Same thing for us. We used the collective as an open talent job sourcing sort of platform that just started working really, really well. I remember vividly when we got to 72 agency partners, we realized, holy crap, we should just managing this network of partners is becoming a full-time job. And there's a lot of opportunity for them to reap the same benefits that we're reaping. So Cult was our positioning change, and the collective was our operating model change. And over the past 5 years, it's allowed us to double our revenues, enjoy double-digit growth every year while reducing headcount. So when we launched Colt, we were at 46 employees, and today we're at 21 employees. And we didn't realize at the time how atypical it would be to continue to grow your top line and your profits while lowering your headcount.
Yeah, that's a great story. And then John, let's loop you back in, because you're, let's call it like, what do you call this platform, Chris? Like this is, a nod to what John's working on, this open assembly, like open platforms. You're working on open platforms, John, not just in the agency space, but in all kinds of businesses, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, kind of the journey to getting there was that about 18 months after I started VNS, I met a guy by the name of David Jones, who was the CEO of Havas, now the CEO of You and Mr. Jones. And he was, he was really provocative. He said, hey, instead of, being the guy throwing the rocks at the glass houses of the holding companies, why don't you come in here and help me remake a holding company? And so, for an entrepreneur, that was a pretty intriguing thing. And so, 18 months after I started, I became chief innovation officer there. Lots of interesting learnings there. And then fortunately, Harvard did a couple case studies on us, one on Pictures and Spoils being born open, and then the other one on Can Havas Change? When I left that, I became part of the lab. And then, one of the things that we saw from the lab's perspective, the lab at Harvard, our lab was started as the NASA tournament lab. And NASA's probably got the most advanced efforts in the open talent space. They've been doing it for a long time and have a really sophisticated way they work, very successfully, kind of an intermediary that sits on top of about 40 different platforms. So they do all the open talent projects for the whole federal government in the U.S. And so lots and lots of great case studies. And what we found in that research is that we know statistically from NASA research over 5 years that you get in about 400 projects, you get as good or better results qualitatively from the client, comparing, closed systems to open systems. But those are produced 4 to 5 times faster and 8 to 10 times cheaper. So, those are pretty astounding things. I think one of the things that we've seen, so we formed this company called Open Assembly out of the lab, just as a commercial entity to help promote the whole industry. There are 1,000 platforms in the open talent space, and a bunch of early adoptive demand side clients, but still there's a huge issue with adoption. I think that's because this is such a radical technology as far as results go. I mean, it's so simple, right? The idea of hiring, instead of employment being binary, either I'm an employee or I'm a vendor with, insurance and all those things, it's kind of creating more gradient of employment, task-based. I need this one thing done. Chris can do a great job. He's the best in the world at it, but I need him for 3 hours. But most companies don't have that ability. And so one of the things we saw in the research that we did when the case study at Harvard for Havas was that, David and I thought that what we got wrong was that we really got the compensation wrong to the 350 global CEOs. Essentially, the value proposition at Havas was, let's take the VNS technology, really similar to what Communo is doing. Let's build that as an internal creative machine inside Havas, so that, one of the questions that David had was, look, we sell a, creative services contractor. We win a pitch for Peugeot. It's $25 million. And we promise, 5 creative teams of 2 people each. So 10 creatives. What happens if we promised all of Havas and had a digital engine to put a brief up and have anybody inside Havas, the 20,000 people, lean into our clients' businesses? Well, the clients loved that, and the C-level loved that inside Havas, and the 350 local CEOs absolutely hated it and killed it. The CEO in Shanghai that was, had spent 20 years earning his way to work on a global brief was not happy when a new 22-year-old came in the door that was digitally savvy. First night he worked at Havas, after his first day, goes on the Havas platform and wins $10,000 on a pitch for Peugeot to do the work out of Paris. That just wasn't a successful thing. But what we thought was that we'd gotten the compensation wrong. I think what it really has happened to all these models and what slowed down adoption is something much deeper, that these new models really threaten the identity of folks that are using it, right? So you see that all the time in places like NASA, where, NASA, one of the famous cases is that, there were 8 physicists trying to figure out sunspots and radiation. So there's too much radiation, right? That radiation would kill an astronaut outside the space station. So best heliophysicists in the world spent 10 years trying to perfect a predictive formula, came up with an algorithm that could predict sunspots at 50% accuracy in an hour and a half. So, one of the heliophysicists said, let's try an open platform, went to an open platform, and in 30 days, a retired cell phone engineer that had a little bit of physics experience came up with an algorithm that was 75% accurate and could predict sunspots in 8 hours for $30,000. So that, in retrospect, that really threatened those 8 heliophysicists' identity, right? They spent 10 years working on something, and then some retired cell phone engineer figured out better than they could. So I think that's the issue that all of us face in this industry, and where we're really focused is in open assembly.
Chris, I want you to translate this, but I want to ask, when I listen to that explanation of the fully open platform like that, it does conjure up some negative images when I think of how it's been applied in the agency business, like CrowdSpring as an example, where it's like you get all the, I'm the win without pitching guy, right? Are we building something that's going to cause all of these creatives and technologists to start solving problems for free without compensation? Is this a race to the bottom, or am I getting it wrong, or is Communo translating that in a slightly different way?
Yeah, no, I think there's a significant difference. First of all, let me just react to one thing John said. I love when he talks about the human nature of threat being a bigger, culprit than monetization or financial models, and people's ego getting involved. We've seen the same thing, and I think it's exasperated in the creative class because we have grown up associating size with success. In fact, we introduce ourselves at industry events by the size of our firm, somehow making that seem like we're significant. And so whether it's people feeling like, is this going to displace me? And therefore, a lot of Communo larger agencies, the biggest critic is the HR hiring manager or the in-house recruiter that now doesn't see a line of sight to their paycheck anymore because we've just automated what they used to spend 50 hours a week doing. So there's a lot of human nature that I think is a bigger barrier to overcome than any sort of practical adoption of the technology or the viability of the solution. But I also don't think it's so binary. Like I have to tell people, Colt went from 46 to 21. It didn't go from 46 to 2. Right? You don't open source the entirety of the staffing model. You prioritize. And I have a little mantra of things that you would never outsource, things you would rarely outsource, things you would sometimes outsource, and things you should always outsource. And so one of our steps in adopting or onboarding new clients is helping them understand how you sort of triage what part of the staff is most important. And going back to the human nature thing, ironically, for most firms, even the most creative of firms, there's a power shift where the account management team becomes the thing you outsource least, and the creative team becomes the thing you outsource more. And for agencies that were birthed by a traditional copywriter and art director, that sort of stereotypical creative origin story, that's offensive. Like to them, their bread and butter was the creative. So how can you make the lowly account manager who used to get coffee for the meeting the most important person in the agency? Well, if you have the right type of account personnel, they are responsible for books of business and revenue. That is more important than a designer. Well, frankly, the best designers don't want to work for your agency. The best designers have already learned how to monetize their craft and are available in an open source model. So I think it's a hybrid in the middle, not one pendulum all the way to the other.
And then you also see like increasingly specialized forms of creative. When I was growing up in advertising, you basically had writers and art directors. And now when I think of the marketing firm that we use, and they use this Hollywood model, it's like, okay, when we do Amazon advertising, we use the Amazon advertising specialist. When we're doing sales conversion copywriting, we use the sales conversion copywriting specialist, CRO specialist, et cetera. So the technology, the creative specialties, but the technology is causing this specialization. The idea that you would have all this in-house and then the technology changes. And what are you're going to lay these people off? You're going to retrain them, et cetera. This seems inevitable to me. John, I cut you off. You're going to speak to something.
No. There's so much to talk about here. I mean, I think that's, I think you're totally right. That insight is awesome. That, back when I had the sports and fitness publishing, in 1995, I spent $100,000 stringing Ethernet cable so that my team, my 120 employees, could get on, dial-up, the internet with the dial-up. But now you go to a coffee shop and it's free. So you don't need the kind of infrastructure to do that. So I think what we're seeing is, I think, Adam Davidson, when he talks about the passion economy, we're really seeing the ability for people to pursue their passions. And I think Communo is a great example of a platform that offers that up. Right. I totally agree with you that there's been this horizontalization of job functions, right? There's so much new kinds of creatives, and there's no way to actually hire the best talent in all those kinds of spaces. Chris, I think, is totally right on as well in this idea that, no matter who you are, you still have to have a curation layer, right? There's so much creative out there and so much good strategy and so many good ideas, execution of ideas, but still on that kind of curation layer, you need the strategy, the strategic brand leadership. You need the connection with the client, but that Chris talked about with great, client leadership and customer service leadership. But everything else you can find the best person in the world, right? I think one of the paradigms that I was super interested in at Crispin is that our clients would pay us for 3 months for a creative director. It was so disconnected to who's the best person. If that creative director in the 3 months was going to do 40 jobs, is that one person the best in the world at those 40 jobs? Maybe they're the best in the world at 20, pretty good at 10, and not very good at 10. So shouldn't you hire to find the very best talent to do that? And I think what's happened is with platforms like Communo, it's really, organizing this new talent base in a way that is adoptable by large companies, right? By brands. Nobody had the ability to do that before.
Yeah, that's probably a pretty good segue to Chris. You tell us about what is Communo? What's the problem that it solves? We've kind of talked around it a little bit.
Well, we label it a talent optimization platform. I think I heard John a month ago or so. Was it people as a service, John? That was a term that you were.
No, talent as a service.
Talent as a service, which I think
Task is better than pass, I think.
Yeah. There you go.
But taking the foundations of a SaaS model, or taking exploiting the elements of the gig economy. But I spend a lot of time, Blair, trying to help people understand that this is not an HR strategy tool. It helps with HR strategy, but if you really embrace the principles of an open talent model, it informs your positioning, it informs your business development, it informs your strategic account management, it informs your utilization and agency financials. It is truly an operating model, which is why I'm glad that we can kind of be talking here today. At first blush, I think it's too quickly dismissed as either a job board or a Rolodex of talent, like a freelancer.com. Well, to demonstrate the difference, freelancer.com brags about $5 logos. Well, I don't know any creative that's excited about getting into a business doing a $5 logo. The average deal on Communo is over $60,000. So it's a completely different paradigm about who you're hiring, why you're hiring them, how they're integrating into your team, how they're servicing it, how they're serving as a seamless extension. And the reality is many agencies have been doing this, I would argue, in an unethical way by white labeling people. They'll go find a freelancer and they'll give them their agency's email address, or they don't let them come to the client meetings. They have to pretend like they're on staff, but they're not really on staff. I know a friend who gets $25,000 just to help clients pitch work. So he's postured as the lead creative director, but when they win the business, he goes back to Venice Beach and they put some hack creative director on the account. So agencies have been faking it for a long time. This is a way to, with pride, bake it into your business model. When Colt pitches clients, our second slide is Communo. And it's the, let me tell you, client, why you are going to benefit from my open talent model. Because even if I was egotistical enough to think that I could attract the greatest talent in the world, as John mentioned, if Crispin Porter is having 60% turnover or some crazy number, and that's the hottest ad agency in the world at the time, Digiday stats last year were for 2018 at least, 30% turnover for agencies over 100 employees. You can't keep them. So even if I was able to lure somebody to my agency, they're going to be gone within the next 1 to 3 years. And then I've just basically made a huge investment for the next agency. I just trained and groomed somebody and made them better for their next job. So I think it's a whole different way of operations, finance, creative, account management, and HR, thinking about a way to improve our specialization, allow us to be more narrow, more true about what we're best at, and then outsource the rest of it. And then your other expertise is your access to those experts. So your expertise is 1, what are you best at? 2, how do you find the best talent in the world for everything else?
The two of you must look at what the traditional agency model and think this just doesn't make any sense anymore in terms of like having everything under one roof and trying to like cycle through talent in a
Well, Blair, we have a client that spends $2 million a year on headhunter fees, and their average employee stays 14 months. How is that a sustainable business model? They're just long enough to pay the full commission to the headhunter and just short enough you got no long-term benefit out of that ROI. And yet their model is maybe we should hire more headhunters. It's like, no. Why don't you stop hiring full-time employees at the same speed and velocity or volume that you're doing it? So yeah, I do. I bang my head against the wall. And while COVID is a disaster in so many ways, it's a gift in terms of waking people up to being more open-minded to reimagine how they build their businesses.
Yeah, I just to add to that, I think Chris is right on. I think what clients have been begging for a long time, and Blair, you know this better than I do, is transparency and the willingness to really understand what's going on, and that kind of the shell game of having the pitch team pitch something like Chris said, and then all of a sudden all those people disappear. I know when I was at one agency, I kind of dug into, one big global agency. I dug into how much time myself and other C-level executives were sold to clients, and we were all at 400%. And I was like, wow, there's 4 of me. There's 4 of like our whole team. It's unbelievable, And I think that kind of stuff is coming back to bite big agencies, right? That there's been so many games. It essentially been a misalignment of goals here. If a brand is set to grow their brand and to have somebody go along with it, the only alternative is to have a variable cost model as a partner, because 1 week you're really focused on Facebook Live, the next week it's Snapchat campaign, and you need to be able to shift those things back and forth. You can't pay the holding cost to have a bunch of people sit around when you're not using them. It's not equitable. So, nor is it transparent. So I think those are kind of the big issues. Hey, and one of the things I was meeting with one of the, literally on March 11th, as things were falling apart, and with the number 2 guy at one of the big holding companies, and he gave me some super interesting figures. They just built a new building in downtown New York, and he said that they'd figured that, you know, for their employees across their network, it costs 2.8 times somebody's salary to actually for benefits, for office space, for receptionists, for all the infrastructure to employ somebody, right? So for a $100,000 employee, that's $280,000 a person to keep them as a place-based member. And then they also did some work, or had a research company look at the productivity, and what they found was, and this is comparable to some numbers that NASA's researched as well, is the average place-based employee in the US works 35% of the day on the things that you hired them to do. So 3 hours of every 8, they're actually working on the projects that you've actually, you know, hired them to do. The rest is social time, you know, corporate time, all those things. And so I think what you're seeing is that just this old model, COVID just pushed us 5 years into the future, and the old model just isn't efficient anymore, right? You can't spend $280,000 for an employee to work 35% of the time. It just doesn't work anymore. You need to get the work done that you want to get done.
Yeah, I think when we look back on it now, well, like once you embrace this model, you look at the old ways and you think it's ridiculous. Why is this still surviving? Then the pandemic hits, and all of a sudden, as you say, John, there's like 5 years of change that happens in 3 months. It's one of the great things I think that's come out of this pandemic. Hey, I asked you both before we went live, do you remember what you were doing in 1996? Chris was in middle school. Because I was on social media last week talking when I was promoting this webinar, talking about the moment when I thought I saw the future of the agency business. I thought things will never be the same after what just happened in 1996. And nobody's been able to guess or remember what happened in 1996 for me to think that the Hollywood studio model was the model of the future. John, what were you doing in 1996?
I was running sports and fitness publishing at the time.
I know what the answer is, Blair.
What is it?
You do?
Yeah, I forget what the name of the company was, but one of the big media companies became an ad agency.
Creative Artist Agency, CAA, a talent agency, took the bulk of the Coca-Cola account away from McCann Erickson. And it just sent this shockwave through the industry. I was 24 years old, and I just went, holy shit. These agencies will not, if the talent, like I thought about the talent that's being used in the commercial, the creative talent, if the creative talent has that much power, I can't see the creative talent residing in the agencies for much longer. And then I was an idiot for 24 years. And I think it took the fragmentation of technology. But I remember thinking for many years after that, why hasn't this happened yet? Why? And it started happening a little bit, right? And in the last couple of years, you've really seen, I'm sure you see it a lot, Chris. When I mentioned my involvement in Communo, we sent out an email. I heard from so many people saying, we've been using this model for years. Really large firm in Europe, I forget how many people, how many millions, just we've been doing this for 10 years. It's a fantastic model. And everybody seems to say, when I say, like, how many people do you have in your pool of talent that you draw on? The answer seems to be about 70. Is there something about that number, Chris?
No, but I when people tell me that, I always think of that old school Rolodex, like on a, the paper-based thing, the wheel that goes around like a hamster wheel, where maybe you can maintain a relationship with up to 70 people, because they tend to be people in your personal network. I remember I wrote a blog once about your network is like your net worth. It can never be too great. And people have to get over this idea that they're going to know everybody and be fully vetted in advance of doing work with them. I think the freelancers in particular have gotten really, really good at, in fact, probably even better than many employees, about ingesting themselves, inserting themselves into a project, adding value, getting briefed, keeping their status, being billable, and getting out. Like, it's not enough just to be good at your craft. You have to be good at being a contingent worker. And so, when you get to that 50, 60, 70 mark, I would argue you're still doing your clients a huge disservice if you're only making available to them the people that you personally know. You should be throwing a much wider net out into the ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm going to say to our audience, if you have questions that you want me to put to Chris or John, just go ahead and type them into the question box. And Chris, I'm going to get you to tell us just a little bit more details about Communo. Like, how does it work? How do you sign up? How does it work on a day-to-day basis? But before you get to that, it's just sharing an observation. I think it's something you said to me at some point when you had this cult collective that you spun off as Communo. One of the things you did is the platform enabled you to communicate with these freelancers. And that's another point. It's not just freelancers, it's small agencies, like you say that. But it also allowed them to communicate with each other. So what happened then?
Yeah, so again, we built this much like Slack for ourselves with no illusions of this becoming a business that it's become. And one of my biggest disappointments was when a creative director or a copywriter or an event marketing person that I loved had to quit and go back and get quote unquote a real job because they couldn't make a living on their own, and I wasn't feeding them enough work for as a full-time replacement to what they were doing. And it was a huge loss for us because like, oh, you're so good at whatever your particular niche skill set was. So, but I was thinking, but I know 71 other agencies that might use you as well. Because in the early days, Colt was the center of the spoke, and I was the only one that had a relationship with each of the 72 businesses. So we just built an app, which at the time, Ryan, my partner, sort of said, think of LinkedIn meets Tinder. Like, how do you just very easily swipe right, swipe left, and find each other? Because we were motivated to find more work for the great craftsmen that we had already found who just couldn't, they didn't know how to operate successful small businesses. So that was when it really, that's when it went from dozens to hundreds to thousands. It was, oh, now the ecosystem is feeding itself and they're not dependent upon Colt to facilitate an intro or to give them the work. That event marketing company is working with that web shop who's working with that photographer, and and we loved it. Like, I didn't need to be the traffic cop coordinating all those introductions. So that's where it became really an app-based tool. Everybody's got the phone. Literally, when I'm in a client meeting and an opportunity comes up saying, well, do we know somebody that can do e-commerce or somebody that can do this event or somebody can do this annual report? I'll raise my hand, say, I can do it. My firm will do it. And I then get in the car and I go on the app and I type in the specs of the job, the requirements, the discipline, the geography, the price point, spend a couple of minutes, and then I'll hit send. And usually by the time I'm back at my desk, an hour or two later, I have 3 to 5 people raising their hand saying, I could help you with that. So what takes normally 36 days to staff a replacement full-time hire, I can do in 3 to 6 hours by putting it out to the network. And, there's all sorts of best practices around how do you describe the job and how do people apply for the job. So, that's what I'm describing here is sort of this best case scenario, but it's the future. And once you've tasted that, like, there's no reason why I would never, I'm making money while I sleep, which is every entrepreneur's dream, because I'm making a markup on all of those services that I'm selling. And I'm dealing with professionals that I haven't been burned. I'm sure I'm going to be, but I've been doing it for 4 years. And the way that we curate and the way that we onboard is ensuring that we're dealing with professionals and not, hacks that are doing just gig work on the side. And it's been phenomenal. It's been life-changing.
That's fantastic. All right. We've got a bunch of questions. I want to start hitting you with some. Mark asks about positioning. Is there an ideal size of agency for your platform? No, that's not the positioning question. That was somebody else. Is there an ideal size of agency for your platform? Specifically, as a small agency working in a smallish market, I wonder if we can afford the best talent given the budgets we deal with.
The power users of our platform are agencies 1 to 20. Because they're going head to head with agencies that are 50 to 100. And so it allows them to punch well above their weight because now they can represent a larger skill set of talent at their disposal. We start to struggle when we get into agencies that are a few hundred because now they're more like Havas or more like Marcel, which is Publicis's tool. They almost need tools just to keep their own people busy and to improve their own utilization versus going to an outside network to find additional complementary talent. So Communo really is for the small independent shop that wants to punch above their weight and win bigger accounts.
Brian has a question I want to put to John. He says, in your opinion, why do you believe that brands/clients continue to work with the major holdcos, knowing the lack of pervasive transparency, high turnover, et cetera, et cetera? Will COVID accelerate? Well, like we're looking for the prediction that the holding companies are going to implode. So will COVID accelerate transformation in the agency business, or will bad habits return because it's the easy path to take?
No, that's a great question. I mean, my sense is that this is a penultimate moment, right? Well, we're going to see a lot of change from this. I mean, my sense is that, brands, I mean, historically, what I used to say about holding companies is that the group, kind of client engagement person, or, would essentially, his job is to create insecurity in the client, to say, when the client said, hey, I want to go use Communo, they would pull out a big deck saying, well, we used to have a client that used Communo one time. They got fired. That CMO got fired. And actually on the way to the meeting, I walked over his legs because he's homeless out in the street, creating that kind of fear. Right. So they were really, really amazing at that. That's one of the things I really, I was just blown away by. But my sense is this is the moment, right? This is the tipping point that this happens. And I think the conditions of why that's happening, and we're seeing it across not just the agency world, but all kinds of different services, is that we're going from a knowing culture to a learning culture, right? And so in the knowing culture, it's you get hired because you know more than anybody else in the world. The McKinseys, the Bains, right? Those the big agencies, the McCanns, the Drogas. You want to have the best team that knows the most on your business. That's gone. COVID's proven that none of us know anything, right? So the reality is that we have to be learning organizations. And when you really dive into it, some of the numbers we've learned at Harvard is that, the average American employer spends 0.03% of an employee's salary on job-specific training, right? Well, the alternative is the average freelancer spends 15% of their time learning new skills. So I look at places like Communo and other platforms, and I say, well, if I had, full-time place-based employment in an agency, I was going to hire them. The learning is so slow in those cycles, right? Whereas I go to Communo and it's a learning organization. They're providing me with the latest, greatest, updated technology, updated thinking on the latest stuff. And so I think that's the big decision why the holding companies aren't going to be able to hold the flood back, right? The finger's been in the dike, but it's going to explode because they are really, really based, their business models are based on being knowing organizations, and that doesn't work anymore. You have to be in a situation where you're part of a learning culture and a learning organization. And that, to me, all these open talent platforms represent that.
All right. John has a question I'll put to you, Chris. And while you're answering it, we've got an offer. I think it's like how people can kind of start their Communo journey. So I'll put that on the screen. New technology, and make sure I don't screw this up. But the question is, I think you touched on this, but it's been upvoted. So how do I represent the talent that my agency would be bringing when it isn't in-house? What does that conversation sound like?
So we always use the possessive, ours and we. So our team and we are able to do these things for you. We are transparent that we're part of a Communo network. The way that somebody maybe in the old days would have bragged about being part of the 4As or being part of the Chamber of Commerce or any other sort of association. So it's cult. You're hiring us for our expertise on audience engagement. And we use Communo as a talent pool for us to service individual implementation needs that might come about under our statement of work, under our master services agreement. All of the Communo members sign a contract of non-solicitation, non-disclosure, non-compete, indemnification. So all of the potential gotchas that might make a client get worried instantly evaporate. And in my experience, clients really don't care. And people over-index when the RFP says you must disclose who the subcontractors are. You just do it. You just have a member of Communo. We subcontract through Communo. Just like when you bought your home, you didn't really care who the electrician was or who the person installing the granite tile was. You just wanted a beautiful home as promised by the home builder. That's been our experience. We promise a great end result, and we give the client the assurance that our problem is going to be staffing this business. Your problem is going to be growing your business.
Okay, thanks for that. So I put the offer on the screen. It's a complimentary access to a Communo adoption framework workshop. Do you want to talk a little bit about that while I look for the next question?
Sure. I mean, this is basically, this is a tease today. We've served you an appetizer of wings or nachos, but there's a meal to be had about all of the nuance. I don't think that this is something that you simply, get the tool and you're off to the races. I think it requires a paradigm shift about how you're going to operate, how you're going to position yourself, and how you're going to improve the financial viability of your business. John mentioned a word earlier about variableness. Communo's tagline used to be volatile industries demand variable models, and it was a horrible tagline. Nobody understood what that meant, but what it was really referring to is if we believe that the creative digital advertising space is becoming more unpredictable, if you're finding a harder and harder time forecasting how much capacity you're going to need 30, 60, 90 days from now, in addition to the app, there's a methodology and a framework that you should embrace. And so, we have the tool, but we also have some professional services that help coach people through that adoption, help disrupt old school thinking and embracing new paradigms, et cetera. So this is simply an offer to say, if you're going to need a little bit more than this 50-minute webinar to fully wrap your head around this, we're happy to continue the dialogue.
Okay, thanks for that. Two more questions, really good ones. I love this question. Can a strong CMO with a strong global brief utilize Communo and cut out agencies?
The short answer is hell yes. That's the whole point, is that we are trying to disrupt now, I don't think that I do think agencies serve a purpose the way that a general contractor serves a purpose for a home builder. So I think the CMO is asking for a lot of work if he's going to physically go and source the creative, the copy, the programmer, the media buyer, et cetera, et cetera. So I still think you need the middleman. I'm still encouraging CMOs to have an agency relationship, but make sure that agency is part of Communo so that they can play that role of general contractor, because most CMOs have too many jobs to do. But big brands, particularly in the past year, we've seen a huge macro trend to in-house agencies. And if that's your preference, those big brand agencies can be on the platform just like a small independent shop.
Wow. So if you're not on the platform, but your client is, it might be trouble. John, I want you to predict the future. I want you to think out 5 years from now. What does the agency landscape look like as Communo shapes the landscape? What's different? What haven't we anticipated?
Yeah, so I think that Chris pointed to a really important trend. Brands are realizing that their most important relationship in the world is with their customers, and it's just like your relationship with your significant other. You wouldn't hire somebody to manage your relationship with your wife, right? Like, I want to get a date. I want to have a date on Friday night, so I'm going to have somebody write a brief and prepare that. So likewise, I think that's a huge trend, right? This internalization. Yet the issue with internalization, internalizing agencies, is they don't always have the kind of great creative talent because it gets stale and boring and more marketing management. And so my sense is that's what's going to happen, from a brand level, is that there's going to be in-house agencies of few very highly skilled folks that are brand strategists and, client services folks that, for the rest of the brands in the company, whether it's a Unilever, a P&G or any big global company. But that you'll use networks, different kinds of networks, and certainly Communo is going to be at the center of that, right? That those kind of networks to bring in that great new skill set, the great creative effort, the variability to build, the one reason I think that freelancers, like you said, the dirty little secret of most agencies and most brands is that they use a lot of freelancers. That Communo just really organizes that and datifies that so that you can really understand who's providing the best talent, what can you get, how do you scale it, all those kinds of things. And I think it's bring kind of, a method to the madness in the marketplace. So I think you're going to see that. And on the agency perspective, I was talking to an A-list agency last week, a CEO, and my prediction is that, their 200-person agency is going to be a 20-person agency, that you're going to have those kind of high skilled folks that we talked about, but then it's going to be filled, the rest of the company is going to be filled with really great, networks of freelancers and folks that can add a lot of value. So I just think that's the future, this variable cost model, right? And other places, like you mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, the Hollywood model has been around for a long time. It's tried and true, and it seems to work pretty well for other industries. And I think it's just an inevitability that that's the way it's going to work here.
Yeah. Thanks for that. We're going to wrap up here. Chris, I'm just going to ask you, so if I'm an agency principal, I'm sitting here watching this, I'm at home, I'm thinking, I don't need this space. It's time to change my business model, but I have these people, I'm going to set them free, basically. Like, how can Communo help with that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful way. It's a wonderful landing pad, particularly what we've seen. I mean, the past 6 weeks of COVID, we've seen thousands of creatives flocking to Communo. We call it the Creative Refugee Camp. Brands like Marriott gift a Communo membership to their displaced marketing talent as a way of helping them as a career placement job going forward. So it is an opportunity for if you're an individual, talented, creative with an itch to be entrepreneurial, you could go join Communo. I kind of call it entrepreneurism with training wheels. Or if you're an agency owner that does need to downsize, it's a way of continuing a relationship with your talent, but just not through a full-time employment contract, more of an on-demand, as-needed contingent worker contract. So it really does serve both masters there.
And in addition to clicking on that offer and signing up, I think it was available to the first 50 agencies, and I don't know how many we have on here. We had over 500 sign up. How else can people learn more about Communo?
Yeah, just go to Communo.com. There's chats that you can create. There's trials that we can provide with demos of the tool. And as I mentioned, there's some professional servicing and additional coaching that we can offer to really help make sure that you're very comfortable. This to me is an exercise of change management as much as it's an exercise of tool adoption. We've had some bad habits for a long time. And so we want to be very empathetic and help agencies move at the pace they're most comfortable with.
Chris Kneeland, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
John Winsor, a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.